I'm Matt Swartley with Chariot Solutions, and I would like to introduce to you Kiki Carter, who is a curriculum developer at Cockroach Labs. Kiki is going to speak with us today about how to take a pragmatic approach to deciding whether or not serverless is the right solution for your project. So please welcome Kiki Carter.
All right. Thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction. And I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be here, even though we are not in person. Hopefully we will be in person again soon. And thanks all who have joined. And I am going to talk a little bit about serverless and a pragmatic approach and really try to bring out the fine print here. And I want to talk about why that matters. So in my normal life, I would be telling you, you should take up serverless, and these are the reasons why you should use serverless. And people understand that serverless is here, and it's something that people maybe should use. But what I want to do is to take a moment to stop and pause long enough to really consider the fine print. Now, I'm not promoting some type of analysis paralysis. Like we shouldn't completely ignore the fine print in the name of making quick progress or for fear that you'll be left behind by the next big wave of this and that thing. So today, instead of trying to convince you you should use serverless, I'm going to more or less try to convince you to stop before jumping on the bandwagon and really think about that. And I'll do that by first laying out a little bit of groundwork and history on serverless, on how we got to this point in the tech journey. Then I'm going to talk about what serverless promises to deliver and uncover a little bit of the fine print there. And then I'm going to directly tell you 7 reasons to skip serverless, right? Wow, should I be doing that? I don't know. We'll see. But that's what I'm going to lay out. And we'll figure out also, hey, what happens if you do skip this? Is there some repercussion? Is there something that may happen? So starting that, hey, let's see. Could you possibly have made it into 2022 without hearing some of these buzzwords? You know, we've got microservices. Someone's going to try to convince you need to do microservices, and not just regular old microservices. You need to do cloud native. They can't be regular microservices. They have to be cloud native microservices. And oh, by the way, you need to do this thing called serverless too. If you haven't heard this yet, then you're probably just really lucky. But chances are you've heard something along those lines here. And there's a reason for it. You know, serverless has its own origin story. And let's talk a little bit briefly about how we arrived here, what really drove this need for serverless technology. I haven't even laid out, okay, what is serverless? But let's talk about first the origin story. Where are we and how did we get here? One thing we can look at is, hey, deploying to production. That has always been sort of a thing with developers and how we can get it done, how we can get it done quickly. And I say deploying to production, but really I mean any environment that is a non-laptop environment. How do I get my code from my laptop into some other environment where I can run it, test it, let other people look at it and try it into production, and so on and so forth. Historically, there have been some real challenges with that. So you've got some hurdles that are both bureaucratic and technical, and they both are related to provisioning and operating. So for example, when you look at provisioning software, provisioning infrastructure for your environment, typically back in the days of old, you would have to speak to someone, so that's our bureaucratic part of it, in order to get the right infrastructure for your environment or request certain infrastructure for your environment. So if I wanted a dev environment, I had to ask someone for it, pull out a ticket, coordinate with the team about this. This is something that was in between me as a developer and seeing my software out somewhere. That was challenging. And it's something that we've had to deal with for a long time before we got to the point where we didn't. And I'm going to go there. Now, provisioning the right infrastructure for your environment also required you knowing the right infrastructure for your environment. And so that could be a technical hurdle, right? You had to do some planning to understand, what do I need in order to run this? Do I need the same things in my dev environment, my stage environment, my test environment? And so then you end up with not only asking for different types of environments, but trying to understand the configurations for all of those environments. And then you had not just provisioning that infrastructure, you have operating that infrastructure and trying to operate it at the right scale. And so again, you've got everything that comes with the environments that you need and operating those, the bureaucratic information around operating those, like what team am I working with, who's actually operating it. Usually it wasn't the developer. Is it an internal team, an external team? Do I need operations for my test environment, my dev environment, my production environment, my prod 1, my prod 2? What does it look like? This could be really daunting for people to look at. And so, boom, we came to the cloud. And the cloud offered us this rescue moment where we're like, hey, you need infrastructure and now you've got it. So unmanaged, we'll talk about unmanaged cloud infrastructure made it easy for you, easy, fine print, if you know what you're doing. So provisioning infrastructure, no problem. It's a breeze. Running it, well, that depends. That depends on who's running it. So you still end up with some of the same problems you had before the cloud. It's just that those problems have moved into someone else's data center, basically. And so, yeah, while you remove this problem of getting infrastructure, you really didn't change what happened for developers. So developers say like, hey, now we got this freedom and this power. I can make my own environment. I can build anything that I want. I can throw it out there. Boom, I've got power and I've got freedom. But what we ended up doing was unknowingly, maybe at the time, trading what may have been speed bumps or perhaps chains, trading those for weights, because the fine print of that was it also added loads of responsibility. And that means that now developers were expected to sort of share the burden of operating and provisioning those environments. So while, yes, you can go on AWS or Google Cloud or Azure and say, I want a VM or I want this or that, and you can pop it up at any moment. But did you even know what size you needed? Why you needed this size? Are you sizing for a test environment? Are you sizing for development? What happens there, right? Oh, I needed Kubernetes. Well, I can go in and provision a Kubernetes environment, but do I actually know how to run Kubernetes environment? Do I know how to operate it? Oh, I need to build my own operators too. The things that look like freedom up front really ended up getting us in sort of a crunch where we've had to pick up a lot of different skills that previously a developer wouldn't need. Now instead of some other team being your roadblock, your only roadblock became how much you knew, how much you could do, how much you could pull out on your own without having help. And so this was further complicated by what I would call a lost decade of specialization in the name of Agile, because we went through this moment of, oh, we've got to have Agile. And with Agile, specialization was positioned as a hindrance to progress. You've got to move fast. And so you can't have any specialized people on a team. And that means that everybody needs to be able to do a little bit of everything in order to, whatever is needed to get to production and run, everybody has to know something about it. And it led to this, what I would call increasing burden, where people had to know everything from Java to, tons and tons of libraries. And this is the same, right? JavaScript, you've seen it there too. You have to know so much. And not only do you have to know so much about your development environment, now you need to know so much about operations. Now you need to know so much about containers, container orchestration. You need to know about securing your environment inside of your cloud. There was just a lot, and perhaps too much, right? And the next evolution was having some managed cloud services. And so that created this other easy button. So you still have easy infrastructure, but at least now you have someone who can help you. You have a team, you have a service that can help you with your ops. So it's easy if you know what needs to happen, even if you don't have to do it yourself. So while you can provision your environment and do all those things yourself, you wouldn't have to, but at least you would still have to understand, if you had a managed service, what you needed from that service. So the managed service couldn't tell you, hey, you need X, Y, and Z for this environment. You need this, and you need to connect here and there and blah, blah, blah. It wouldn't tell you that. It would just say, hey, do you know what you need? I'll manage it for you. I'll put it there. So you still had to know quite a bit in order to use many managed cloud services. But now serverless. So what is this promise of serverless, and how does it come about that this is to help you? You know, how do we get from we've been blocked by other people. Now we've blocked ourselves with all the stuff we need to know. Now we're trying to unblock ourselves with managed services. What can really unblock us as developers? And again, we've heard so many promises about things that can unblock developers, but let's talk about this promise of serverless and what it intends to give you. And what serverless really looks like is what we would call a black box and white glove service. So it's both the technology that's handled for you, and to some extent, the operations and bureaucracy that comes along with operations are sort of handled for you. And what serverless really is this closing of the gap around operations. And we say that, hey, serverless products are cloud-based platforms that try to go from low to no operations. In an ideal world, this would be a zero operations environment. And the goal is to help developers, architects, organizations get started and deliver and continue on without any hindrances in either starting or scaling their projects. So serverless at its core is really deeply about operations, because what it does is it allows you to abstract everything around your outer architecture with the product that you're interacting with, so that you are solely interacting with the product. You're not interacting with any of the outer architecture of your product. You're simply interacting with your product. And I'll talk about with what type of product it may be. So maybe you're building some stateless applications or some stateful applications. You're interacting with the code itself. You have your code and you're putting your code out on your serverless platform without any notion about how it's being run, or without you having to run it. You do understand some things about how it's being run, but you're not orchestrating that yourself. So there are some examples of products that we have. You have stateless products that may be, functions, either ephemeral functions or long-running functions. And we say stateless, but of course the state lives somewhere. I'll talk about that later. Then you have stateful applications. And those may be things like durable objects, or applications like stateful applications like Akka Serverless or Dapper. And then you have databases. Databases themselves can also be serverless. So sometimes you had managed databases, but the difference between a managed database and a serverless database is, again, the serverless database truly abstracts everything away from you and allows you to interact with the database the same way you'd be interacting with the database. For example, if you were on your laptop, you're sending your commands, you're connecting, and you're really interacting. You don't worry about everything that's going on outside of it. And so this sort of offers you some benefits, and I'm going to talk about the benefits that we say are offered when you go into serverless. So, of course, as I mentioned, we'll get into the benefits, but we'll also talk about the fine print of each benefit that is offered for you in serverless. First, you've got your getting started quickly as a developer. Wow. How many times have we heard you can get started quickly? You can focus only on your business logic. You can insert that into perhaps I don't know how many talks you've been to already, but guaranteed one of them has said, if you do this, you will be able to focus only on your business logic and nothing else. And getting started quickly is really not the only game in town. And the fine print here is sometimes your getting started quickly is with the hello world experience, as I would call it. And that usually means, hey, I can do a hello world experience with this product, but the lift between hello world and producing something of meaningful value to my company may be more than you've bargained for. So you have to be wary of that. You have to understand what the lift is there, whether the vendor or the product has adequate support for your journey, whether there are docs, your training, example applications, what's going to help you? Is there, how well is this abstracted? Will it translate well from what I've been doing before the serverless product appeared to what I'm doing after? You know, you have to be wary of this getting started quickly because, like I said, getting started quickly is not the only game in town. You need to be able to move from getting started into creating meaningful value, and you have to understand the lift between that. Next, serverless promises you easy integration between your serverless functions or applications and your cloud resources. The fine print, integration is easy, and you can integrate with everything if your integration is with the things that we have offered. So if you are using resources that are specific to that cloud provider, for example, if you're using AWS Lambda and you need security or SNS or Kinesis or something like that, sure, it's super easy to integrate. And you will have a very smooth experience. But you have to, again, be aware when you're looking at serverless and you're looking at the ease of integration, sometimes that's highly dependent on what's offered in the serverless platform. Another one, we say serverless platforms are secured for you. And yes, kind of. Usually you do get the benefit of security patches in every platform. Every product may be different and may offer various ways of securing, but your functions themselves have to be secured. And again, that depends on what the cloud provider offers you to secure. You have to understand what threats are present for you. So some third-party companies are tooling that will allow you to perform threat assessment of your functions or your applications. Your code itself must still be secure. So you can't say, oh, security out the window, it's serverless, so I don't have to think about security. Things like secrets management are not always straightforward. Again, this can depend heavily on what you're using in your environment. And remember, serverless by nature is a multi-tenant environment usually. And so security and isolation are key. And typically, every product will say, hey, we offer security, we offer isolation, but understanding how it works within those environments or what they offer is very important. And that is something that you have to consider in fine print. Serverless products promise to scale with you. They're like, hey, we will scale whatever you need. And the fine print there is it really depends on your unit of scale. Products have to support not only the scale of your user base without manual intervention, but also support scale of development and maintenance. So can I develop on this platform with other people? Is there something about this serverless platform that doesn't allow me to work as a team with others? Will it automatically scale for traffic in near real time? Usually, right? But there are other terms of scale that you have to think about when it comes to development and usage. So promising that your product will scale, you have to think about the fine print. Is it scaling just for the customer base, or is it scaling for my team and my ability to deliver? Speaking of scale, the nice thing with serverless products, one of the great promises is you can pay as you scale. We say pay as you go, or also pay as you scale, but you still need to know what that scale looks like. So it offers, sometimes we call predictable billing, but that's predictable if, well, billing is predictable. So if you understand what your usage patterns look like, what you're paying per usage, you don't want to end up with a billing surprise. And with serverless, and also this happens obviously with managed cloud products as well. But with serverless, it's something you should certainly think about, because that doesn't disappear. The idea that, hey, you pay as you go is really a wonderful idea, but you still need to understand that there's going to be cost as you scale. Another thing you can see from serverless is a simplified overall architecture. One of the promises that you have. But again, that sort of depends on how you put together your serverless products. So if you had thousands or tens of thousands of functions, it might still be hard to diagram that, depending on the level of diagram that you're drawing, depending on your levels of integration. If your serverless portion of your application or your system interacts with a lot of non-cloud resources or unmanaged cloud resources, or a mix of managed and unmanaged in cloud and on-prem, you could still end up with some pretty complex architecture. You could argue that maybe, oh, the serverless part that was simplified, but if it's hard to integrate with all those other parts, and there ends up being complexity of supporting that, it could also become really, really complicated really quickly. So you have to watch that and be mindful of how that could escalate. Another great benefit or promise of serverless that you have to watch out for in the fine print is your simplified talent acquisition. So I'll take a moment to talk about this, because like I said earlier, hey, we got to a point where developers were empowered to use a lot of technology, to have access to technology, to spin it up, put it in environments really, really quickly. And what happened was you needed to understand how to use all of that and operate it. So instead of knowing JavaScript and Java and Go and Rust, you had to know all of those things, as well as Docker and Kubernetes, and how to secure your applications, how to secure functions, how to integrate with message queues like MQTT, or how to integrate with Kafka. And it just became a lot. And so you get into 2022, and I have seen this, I can tell you, you get a rec for a junior developer, maybe sometimes a mid-level developer, and you've got a list a mile long of all the things that you need to know in order to do this job. And that creates this crazy job description bloat. And it would be nice to bring back some reasonable specialization. And not saying like, hey, we're going back into this hyper focus, you're drawing walls around people, something like that. No, but everyone knows that reasonable specialization works very well in industries. For example, if I need heart surgery, I'm probably going to want a heart surgeon and not a foot surgeon, for example. And so it makes sense to have some specialization and to not expect people to know too much about everything. Like, hey, that I know we're using containers and how containers generally work, and that they need to be orchestrated. That's important. Sure, we should know that. And if you want that on a resume, fine. But expecting people to always know everything about Kubernetes, you're expecting developers to have almost the same skills as your ops team, and then say, oh, it's because of DevOps. I don't think that's scalable. And I think that sometimes it can take away from some of the joy that you have in your development, because, hey, if I'm a developer, I would love to be working on the things that drive value in improving the products or services that I'm creating. And doing that, anything that really distracts me from being able to do that, whether it may be interesting or not, sometimes people find it interesting, and that's great, I do too, but detracting from your core business is probably not a great idea to do. So eliminating this job description bloat is a great one, but fine print, if you are hiring solely for the serverless part of your application. Now, if someone has to work on the serverless part of your application, whether it's the database that's serverless or your application that's serverless, there's only a portion of it that's serverless, that works. But if they need to work with integrating with other parts of your system, or you need them across other areas of the company, this may not work for you. You may end up with even more bloat, because now you've got to add serverless product ABC to the list of everything else that someone needs to know. So that's something to obviously be mindful of. Now, I've given you some of the fine print and kind of hinted at some of the things you need to be mindful of if you're looking into serverless and you see like, hey, these are the benefits that are offered, and here are some of the things to be wary of. And now I'm just going to come out and tell you straight up, here are some reasons to really think twice about using serverless if you need to use it right now in its state today. Right? So one, if you have very unique privacy or security needs within your organization, then serverless may not be for you today. You shouldn't assume that your security needs are unique. You should absolutely investigate them. You should see, okay, what security do I have in place now for authorization? What do I have now to implement access control, authorization, authentication? How am I protecting my system today? Is there something that matches with what the serverless product offers? Those are things you should consider. But if you don't find that being met, those needs being met, you should hold serverless aside for a moment. If you have to abide by certain GDPR rules and the serverless product that you're looking at isn't quite there yet with isolation in the sense of geographic data isolation for GDPR or other countries or regions that come up with rules around data protection, you may need to leave serverless aside right now. That would be a reason to skip it and come back later to serverless. If you have some multi-tenancy restrictions for some reason, many companies, not many, there are companies in place who have restrictions around whether or not they can be multi-tenant. And yes, there are people who say, there are products who say, hey, we protect your data, we isolate it from other tenants, you won't be in that same situation, you won't share your data with them. You know, people make such promises. And I believe that companies deliver on such promises. But nevertheless, there are still organizations who have specific restrictions about living in a multi-tenant environment for whatever reasons they have, and they can be very valid reasons. If you have such restrictions, then you'll have to skip serverless. This will be one reason to say serverless out the door, okay? If you have unique workload environments, or workload requirements, that means that you have a workload requirement that maybe would just upset the apple cart if you put it in a serverless environment based on what, again, the vendor can offer you. Like, I need to be very highly tuned in order to deliver what I'm delivering to my customers. So I know the high tuning that I need. I know that I need these machines, those machines. I know that I cannot depend on the serverless application to scale in the exact way that I need to scale for my workload. I don't want to risk waiting for them to scale because I don't know their scaling algorithm. I don't know if it's going to react as fast as I need it to react, right? Serverless environments don't usually change their, I guess, reaction algorithms to tune for every single customer specifically. So you do have managed cloud environments that will do certain things like that. You'd be able to tune it better for use. If you have very, very unique workload requirements, though, you may look at a managed cloud service rather than a serverless environment. Speaking of, you should also investigate the long-term cost to run serverless at scale. If that cost is high, if it will actually cost you more to run at scale, And by cost, it's not just a dollar value, right? You have to think about, hey, there's infrastructure involved, there are people involved, there are teams. What cost do I have? What have I saved? Has it matched up? Is there a cost of operations that I'm saving on? Am I not saving on it, right? You have to look at that. Yeah, micro billing is great. Pay as you scale is wonderful. But sometimes it can happen. Your company may not benefit from running serverless at scale again as it is today. Now, I truly believe that serverless is catching up on a lot of this, but today there are some times where running serverless at scale may not meet your needs as a company. If it doesn't, you should skip it. And speaking of your needs being met, if you're not sure that the vendor can scale their own operations to meet your needs, you should skip it. Again, when you have unique workload requirements, when you have high scale, you have multi-tenancy, maybe you have a large user base, and even the best developed products run into problems. Can your vendor support team handle a support ticket from you? How many simultaneous failures can they manage? Like if you've got this great, wonderful team that's built a serverless product and it's a team of 5 people, that product may be awesome. But if something goes wrong with you and you're a huge company, you made a bet on that, you should be really clear about, hey, what are they going to do in case something happens in their operation to your operation? How are they going to scale their operation to support you? If you're not sure that they can scale to support you, you should skip it. Now, that being said, doesn't matter, yes, sometimes the size of a team matters, but you can't just say like, oh, the team is too small, they won't be able to support me. That may or may not be true, but it is certainly something to think about and something you should ask. If you ask questions and you probe and you find out like, this may not meet my operational needs, they may not be able to scale, then you should absolutely skip serverless and skip that product. If you have unique or varied integration needs that are unmet by the serverless product, you should skip serverless. And by unique or varied integration, I mean, are you integrating, again, with some on-prem? Are you integrating off-prem? Does the product that you're using allow you to integrate with the things that you integrate with in your non-serverless environment? Say, for example, you have Kafka integration, or you're using cloud events, or you're using something or another. Does that application, does that environment allow you to take cloud events? Does it have any standardization around there? Does it allow you to easily interact with Kafka? Does it allow you to easily interact with other technology? You should understand if that is the case. If that is not the case, if your integration needs are unmet, if it's going to be a really big burden to integrate, or if it's a point of, if it's a make or break deal breaker point, like I have to be able to integrate with Salesforce from this or else, or something or another or else, then you should probably skip this serverless product or skip serverless, or wait it out. My thought is to wait. And then one of the main reasons to skip serverless is if ops is truly your main business. Now, maybe you feel serverless already. Your company could already have a very well-oiled machine. You may be running in cloud, even on-prem, and your developers are able to deliver without any ops friction. You may be the company who would be developing a serverless product for someone else to use. For example, Amazon was not always a cloud company. Amazon solved a problem for their business that turned into an entire other business unit for Amazon. And that's just simply amazing, right? And there are some amazing organizations out there who run their ops very well. And for them, that is a differentiator. If ops is not your main business or is not your differentiator, then you might want to go with serverless. But if it is your main business and is your differentiator, and you would actually be the person developing some product that would be on serverless for someone else to use, then obviously you don't need serverless. If your developers are not experiencing any friction, even if you're not developing applications for someone else, if they're not experiencing any friction and your company is willing to continue to invest in that because it's moving so well for you, you're like, hey, we don't want to change what's not broken, then, skip serverless. It's you don't have to use it, right? If you're not running into those problems, you don't need serverless. Now, finally here, I've talked about what you will, why you should skip serverless, but what will you miss out on if you ignore serverless today? So there are many so-called benefits that I can list that you may miss out on in case you ignore serverless today. But perhaps the one that people forget or overlook the most is the ability to influence products at their early stage. So as many of you are developers, you know what you want, you know what you need. And now more than ever, companies are starting to look to developers to shape and influence their products and really hoping to deliver on your needs. And it's not just developers either. We've talked about the serverless story, and a lot of the story is around operations and operational challenges and getting infrastructure and orchestration, right? How much of that are you able to erase from the developer's deployment story? How much of that operations are you able to abstract in a meaningful way, not abstract in a way that, hey, this is going to tie a hand behind my back because I have no idea what's going on, but to abstract in a smooth way where I'm, again, interacting with my product itself without interacting with the outer architecture. How can I influence that? Even though you see many cloud functions have been around for a long time, AWS Lambda has been around for a while, some stuff is newer, Dapper and things like Akka Serverless, for example, or many serverless databases, those are somewhat newer and those are developing all the time. And right now is a really excellent time for you as a developer, as an architect, as an ops engineer, as someone who may benefit from serverless, should be influencing these products. So you should be trying out products on your own. The great thing about serverless is usually a free trial. It's pay as you go, so you're not going to have any surprises. Typically, when you're on a development mode, you have ways to cap it so that you don't have a surprise bill. And being able to try things out and to influence the direction of these products at this moment is going to be such a huge benefit and something that you don't want to miss out on. Like I said, companies are looking to developers to shape and influence these products at their early stages. And to be able to do that and say, this is exactly what I need and exactly what I want, and to see that being put into the products that are being developed and released, that's something that's truly amazing and something that I wouldn't want to miss, that I don't want to miss, that I don't want other people to miss out on. And so now I will go into my question and response because I wanted to leave time for you to do that and leave it at that. So let's hear some questions. What do you think about serverless and whether or not you've been convinced you should rethink it or you should try it now?
Thanks very much, Kiki, for that presentation. There's a question and a comment so far in the Slack channel, but I would encourage other people to contribute any thoughts or questions that they have. So the first one is that you mentioned GDPR. The question is, what is the state of Hipaa compliance?
Yeah, I did just mention GDPR, but Hipaa is another one, other PII. There are some products that will say like, hey, we are compliant. There are other ISO compliance tools that or standards that people have. It's something that you should consider. If you're a healthcare company, and you need to be considerate of HIPAA, of any data privacy or data protection laws, then you have to consider that with with the company that you're using, with the product that you're using. Again, there are products that are aware of that and that have mechanisms in place to help protect your data and help you to isolate your data and help you to use proper, appropriate encryptions for encryption at rest, encryption on the move. But that's a really important question. That's a really important consideration for that, for sure.
We also had a comment that was a great point about missing out on the opportunity to influence the direction of emergent technology if you decline serverless today. And then a question around that is, how do you see organizations that offer serverless products addressing the caveats that you mentioned in your presentation in the future?
That's also a really good question. I think that companies are going to eventually meet some of those caveats, are going to eventually close some of the gaps in the caveats. For example, a long time ago, there was a time when the government the US government would never put anything in the cloud. There was a time I worked where the US government had an actual list of, these are the open source tools that we can use, and these are the libraries that we can use. And that list was really small, and it grew and it grew. And at a time, they would never use the cloud. And now you see many government agencies in the US that they're putting their applications and products in AWS on the cloud. You see banks even using, some fintech companies are also using the cloud. So I think that two things are going to happen. I think one, providers and products are going to sort of close those gaps, like you said, around HIPAA, around data protection, around putting in features that allow people to account for GDPR and allow people to have data separation. They're going to continue to add such features. But additionally, I think that many companies are going to come around to understand, like, one, maybe I don't need what I thought I needed in terms of security. And also, I think that some companies are going to be okay with putting the risk out. They're going to say, like, look, this is a risk, and I'm going to go with this serverless platform, or I'm going to go on the cloud and I'm going to put this risk out, but I'm going to make so much progress between now and when that I might actually hit a wall on this risk that I'll be able to manage it in such a better way, right? They're going to say, like, hey, by then I'll have, for example, hey, I run the risk of running out of money if I run it if I run too much. But if you make loads of money between now and hitting that risk point, then you'll be able to, again, handle that better. So like I said, you'll have three different ways this will converge. One, providers and vendors will start closing the gap with adding more features, especially as people influence what features are needed and talk about what they need exactly. You're going to have companies saying, sort of bending on what they think they need. Like, you know what, I thought I needed this, this, and this. I don't really need that in order to make good progress. And then you're going to have people who are going to say, I see these risks. I see that the benefit is larger than the risk, and I'm going to take the risk there.
Okay, thanks for that answer. Another question we have is, one of the challenges we've noticed with serverless is cold starts. We have found a workaround to ping resources from time to time to make them warm. Anything you'd suggest to improve cold starts?
Yeah, and that's interesting. A lot of times you have issues with cold starts when, depending on the tool that you're using. For example, if you are using ephemeral functions, you do end up with cold starts sometimes. There are some things that people can do. There are new products that will allow you to have long-running functions. So initially, functions were all ephemeral, but there are long-running functions and there are durable functions that you can use and durable objects, and things like actor-based serverless features or serverless objects that you can use, like Akka or even Dapper actors. And those allow you to have, more hot starts. And then when you have something like a serverless database, for example, you can look at, okay, how fast, if you say a cold start, for example, between the time that you need to scale, you can look at how tuned it is. Like, hey, how often is the product checking whether or not a threshold has been met and it needs to scale. If it's checking every 2 seconds or 6 seconds or 10 seconds, you can look at that as well to determine whether or not it's good and whether or not it needs to be tuned or whether or not you should look at a different product. But if you are experiencing cold starts, one of the things that I would think about and look at is the architecture, in a sense. Which product am I using? Am I using ephemeral functions where I could be using a function that is longer running? Am I using functions where having something stateful might make a difference, where I wouldn't have a cold start? Am I using for example, a data store that doesn't poll enough, or a feature that doesn't poll enough to know when to increase the resource usage? Am I using something that has intelligent resource management that can be more predictive? Those are some of the things that I would think of.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. All right. So are there any other questions from the attendees from the Slack channel? I guess I have a quick question that you can either choose to answer or not. I mean, were there any interesting anecdotes or stories that led you to put this talk together? I mean, were there things that you were seeing with clients or in the companies that you worked for specifically that led you to realize that you need to tell people maybe not always to use serverless?
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? Sometimes you run into people who are trying to use a serverless product. I've run into companies that have been trying to use serverless products, but didn't really understand how to use them and didn't really understand, again, some of the caveats. And so they didn't have that wonderful first time experience with it and thought, hey, I can't use this. Like a great question from the previous question around, hey, we're having cold starts. Once I got people to understand, like, hey, serverless can be used in many different ways. There are different tools you can use and ways you can tune in order to have less cold starts. They're like, oh, okay. So maybe it does work well for me. And part of that is understanding what are the different ways you can be serverless. What are different products that can be serverless, and what are the different architectural patterns you should be using? Another thing I saw was people saying, like, hey, I have a very unique workload, and seeing like, okay, that workload much better. You know exactly what you need. You're running this in a well way. You probably can wait for serverless to meet a need that you actually have. So generally, it's been sometimes seeing people who don't necessarily have the need for serverless, and that is obviously quite rare, right? Quite rare. I do see people that don't really have the need for serverless because they have that well-oiled machine. But then I see people who have a need for serverless, but aren't necessarily ready to take it on because, hey, there are this, and this reason why I can't really take on serverless right now.
Okay, thanks for that. All right, there actually is two other questions. They're both related to specific cloud serverless providers. The first is, based on your experience, which cloud serverless providers are gaining popularity? And which serverless provider do you think is complete, meaning it has everything that we need to go serverless? Mm-hmm.
So, all right, which ones are gaining popularity in terms of cloud providers? You've got Google Cloud is definitely gaining popularity. AWS already has sort of the lion's share there, but Google Cloud is gaining popularity. And you see Azure also gaining lots of popularity, especially among enterprises who have been using Microsoft, IIS in the past, people who feel like, whether it's true or not, that they can do an easier lift and shift onto Azure because they've been using Microsoft products. Whether or not they are complete and have everything you need, that would of course highly depend on what you specifically need. But what I would say about that is, your cloud provider, I wouldn't look necessarily to the cloud provider itself as the sole solution for my serverless product. And I will say that because, you know, I'm not a person who's against vendor lock-in. I don't say like, oh my God, if you have vendor lock-in, you won't be able to, you know, move forward in the future. Sometimes having vendor lock-in is a good thing if you need to integrate really well. If you look at Azure, Google, AWS, they have pretty much everything that you need in terms of integration. However, if you want something that is above, you know, hey, something that is truly what I would say serverless above the cloud infrastructure that will allow you to scale and use multi-cloud, which is where I think serverless should be, then you should look at actual serverless products that aren't necessarily the cloud product. So instead of looking at just using it, and maybe using, you know, Google Functions or AWS Functions is good to get started. But if you're looking at something that you can use across cloud vendors, I would look at things like Dapper. I would look at things like I mentioned, like Akka Serverless. I would look at cloud, like durable objects. I would look at serverless databases. Look at the products there, the products that are from companies that are solving your problems around data stores, that are solving your problems around applications, that are solving your problems around even functions that are not a part of AWS or Google or Azure. Again, you can use those and you can have pretty much everything you need. And vendor lock-in, again, is not always the worst thing in the world, but being able to get above that and being able to use a product that allows you to, again, like to span your architecture so that you can use one cloud provider or another for various reasons, right? Maybe you need to be multi-region. I think that that's something that's important to consider.
Okay, thanks for that answer. So I think that's pretty much the end of the questions. I would encourage people, as you think of things, either in the next few minutes or later today, to post the questions into the Room B channel. And Kiki, thank you so much for taking the time to present at ETE today. And is there anything that you want to leave us with before we shut down?
No, thanks everyone. Try some products, try some serverless products. I put CockroachDB serverless there because I know that's super easy to get started with, but there are others out there that you can try out and get to influencing the direction, because now is really the time for that.